Welcome back, and joining us right now, the Canadian men's national team reporter for MLSsoccer.com, Daniel Squizzato. Daniel, welcome again, my friend.
Thanks as always for having me, Anthony.
Daniel, I looked at this roster, and I got to be honest, I'm not surprised. Maybe a couple, as we're going to talk about now. But other than that, I'm content with this roster. Obviously, Julian de Guzman not fit, not at 100%, or else he would have been in that Ottawa Fury match against the Cosmos last night. But other than that, I'm happy with a couple of surprises. Luca Gasparotto, Petrasso. This is good. Some young influx on this team and a lot of veterans. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel as though the important thing to remember with the Canadian men's national team roster is that it's going to be pretty stable and pretty steady from one camp to the next. This is a team that has that core of veterans, and we see guys coming back into the mix, guys like Atiba Hutchinson, Will Johnson, who weren't there at the Gold Cup, rather. Well, they definitely weren't there at the World Cup. And the impact that they're going to have. A guy like Issy Nakajima Farron, who has had a great season so far in Malaysia. I don't know too much about the relative strength of the Malaysian league, but I'd say it's probably, maybe a step up from the National League in Belize. He's been scoring over there and gets a call back into the roster. And other than that, as you say, the big changes from one camp to the next are going to be the insertion of a couple of newcomers, some fresh faces. You mentioned a number of 20-year-old guys. Michael Petrasso at QPR, he's done well, out on loan in the last couple of years, scored some goals. Luca Gasparotto, big center back who's been playing for a couple of years in Scotland now. You've got Sam Adekubi from Vancouver Whitecaps, who's a fullback that's had some playing time and some success with them so far. So it is a matter of getting some young faces in against what should hopefully not be too stern a test against Belize, and to try to figure out whether any of these younger guys might have a role to play once the semifinal round gets going in November, and as World Cup qualifying continues in hopefully a couple more years to go.
I don't know about you, Daniel, but I had a big smile on my face when I saw Will Johnson's name on this roster. So happy to see this guy back on the roster. So happy to see him fit, healthy, and ready to go after that devastating injury here in Toronto. This guy, to me, is going to be a major key with Julian de Guzman and others around him if we really have a chance to get to the Hex.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Will Johnson, it's an interesting case. Of course, as you say, first of all, for him to come back from the injury he came back from is great news, but obviously for his club and for his country as well, especially given the recent experience that the Canadian national program has had with a guy like Josh Simpson, who suffered a similar injury, and it ultimately forced his retirement. So to see Johnson come back to the national team mix is great news, to be sure. He does inspire some mixed emotions amongst some Canadian fans. I mean, I think in Vancouver fans, they remember some things he's done at the club level against the Whitecaps, and so fair enough on that. But some other people they maybe question his dedication to the program or his heart or things like that. And I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, what we can look at is, do the players show up and do they perform when they're on the field? I mean, I look at the fact that Johnson, the decision was made for him not to play during the Gold Cup. Could he have helped Canada during the Gold Cup? I would think so. But you look at the fact that he did commit to go down to the last two World Cup qualifiers, go down to Dominica, didn't see the field, but just to get himself integrated into camp, get familiar with Benito Floro. I look at things like that as a sign that there is that level of commitment. And even now, these World Cup qualifiers against Belize, MLS doesn't break for this international break, so I'm sure the Timbers would have liked to have Will Johnson around, but he made the decision to join the men's national team and incorporate himself ahead of this next cycle. So ultimately, I think whether it's Will Johnson or anyone else in the Canadian program, the best way for us to judge them as national team players is do they show up, and when they show up, what do they get done? Will Johnson is a guy who has had some success in a Canada jersey in the past, and hopefully has some more success ahead of him.
Daniel, let's talk about it before we close it out. Twitter was ablaze all afternoon when Kyle Bekker was named on this squad. He was taking all sorts of shots left, right, and center, and obviously Jonathan Osorio, Ashton Morgan not on the squad. I am not surprised, to be honest, in regards to Ashton Morgan. I love Ashton, but I don't think he's played enough to get called up. Jonathan, yes, I am surprised. I think he needed to be called up, but he wasn't, and we don't know all the things that are taking place behind the scenes. But as for Kyle Bekker and the hate that some of the media guys have on for this guy is unbelievable. I mean, the guy doesn't pick up the phone and beg Benito to call him up. Obviously, Benito calls him up because he sees something in him. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you raise. When a guy like Kyle Bekker, it makes me think of another guy, some other guys, guys like Tosaint Ricketts and Nick Ledgerwood and players like that who have who tend to get a lot of criticism when things don't necessarily go their way when they're suiting up for the national team. And you said it perfectly there, Anthony, in that Kyle Bekker isn't forcing his way into camp. He's not, he's holding something for ransom and forcing Benito Floro to call him up. He's a guy who is trying to make the best of his professional career, and if the national team manager sees something in him that justifies calling him up, then the fact that we have players like Bekker, like Ricketts, like Ledgerwood, like so many other guys, whatever their failings may be, we so often wonder, we complain and we mope and we whine about the players who don't choose to suit up for Canada or who are on the fence. And it's even like I was talking about Will Johnson a second ago. People's like, oh, he turned down a call-up once, so let's turn against him. Because we want these players that are willing to suit up for Canada. Well, you've got these guys, again, whatever their failings or shortcomings may be, who show up every time they're called. And, if you are displeased with Kyle Bekker getting the call, Kyle Bekker should not be the place you're directing your anger. Direct it at Benito Floro, the guy who called him. Because if Benito Floro believes that Kyle Bekker is a better option for the men's national team than Jonathan Osorio, then we probably need to ask some questions about Floro's, personnel decisions in that regard. I mean, Becker's a nice story. We all had high hopes for him when he went high up in the draft. But he's going to turn 25 in less than a week, and he's I would say that he's had plenty of time to show himself ready for the international level, and he just hasn't hit that plateau yet. And whether, with the case of Osorio, whether it's a deal between the CSA and TFC, I've been led to believe that that's not what happened, or whether it has something to do with Osorio's reaction during the Gold Cup when he was subbed out of the game, or the way that he was utilized during that competition. I mean, when you look at it, this is thankfully a midfield, like you say. You've got Hutchinson, you've got Johnson back in there. Issy's been doing well, as I say. We've got Russell Tybert fresh off winning the Voyageurs Cup. So there is depth in this midfield, and I don't think that, barring some kind of catastrophe, Kyle Bekker is going to see the field. And so I think if people want to use him as this lightning rod of criticism, I mean, by all means, because I don't think he has shown that he's earned that consistent call-up. But at the end of the day, the one doing the calling is not the player, it's the manager. And if you have a concern with player personnel, then the questions need to be asked about the manager.
As we close it out, Daniel, you keep talking about Benito Floro, and a lot of people were not happy the way the Gold Cup finished off for Canada. I wasn't too overly upset. Obviously, not getting the goals that we needed and the offensive production. I understand that. I mean, some of the selections I weren't happy with, on and on. But to me, I think he's going to be judged. Obviously, we're hoping that they get past Belize in the next round, where there's going to be some heavy hitters they're going to go up against. And we're going to see the selections he makes. We're going to see the tactics he's employing. And we're going to see how he's going to work under pressure in some of these big CONCACAF nations when he goes down there for some big games. And I think that's when we're going to see, a lot of people start throwing criticism at his way if he doesn't answer the bell to some of those things. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that it's well put the way that you just framed it there. In that World Cup qualifying is ultimately where the manager is going to be judged, and it's the purpose for which he was hired. Everything that he's done to this point in his 2 years at the helm, whatever any person may think of it, it has been building up to World Cup qualifying, to the extent that he, perhaps even viewed the Gold Cup as a bit of preparation for World Cup qualifying in a way. That manifested itself in a disappointing result. But that's why I personally reacted with such fervor when people started calling for him to be fired after the Gold Cup, after going out of the Gold Cup, conceding one last-minute goal over the course of 3 games, because it showed kind of a very narrow view of what his purpose is. The ultimate purpose of any national team manager is to get their team into the World Cup. And Canada's traditional stumbling block in CONCACAF qualifying has been getting results on the road, specifically getting results in Central America. And I think that, whether or not Floro's plan turns out to be the right one can only ultimately be judged based on the results that he's able to accumulate. So I think that we can't sit here and say, well, he's come up with the wrong plan or he's come up with the right plan. We just don't know. We'll know when we see the Canadian team go down to Mexico, go down to Honduras, go down to El Salvador, and see what happens in those games. You just had my colleague Dwayne Rollins on your show, and one thing that he's said several times in the last few years is that no matter what happens, 8-1 is not going to happen again, because however this World Cup qualifying campaign ends up, the team is now bought into this structure that Floro and Floro brings with him that attitude and that credibility from his lifetime of managing around the world, that the players have bought into it, and the window of success is so narrow in that World Cup qualifying group. It's 6 games, 3 at home, 3 on the road, that snatching a completely boring, uninteresting, unenlightening 0-0 draw on the road might not seem like it's going to set the world on fire, but if you can do that down in San Pedro Sula or down in El Salvador, and you are earning a point out of that game rather than letting your opponent gain 3 points, that can be the difference between advancing and not advancing. And so I think that this is the time, like I said, where it gets serious, and we're going to see whether what Benito Floro has been planning for actually comes to fruition. And of course, it'll all depend on whether players are available, whether players are able to show up. Are they hurt? Do we get CONCACAF'd by the refs? There are so many elements beyond his control, but ultimately the Benito Floro era is going to be judged by whether or not we're sitting here in 2017 and still talking about the team being alive in World Cup qualifying.
Well said. And what I'm glad about, ever since Benito came on board, that we don't have to continuously talk about guys that we have to beg to come and play for this nation. We know who they are. Let's not mention them. So that's one thing I'll take away that he brought into this nation and into this camp, is that he doesn't pick up the phone and beg anyone. You want to be part of it, you're welcome. We'll embrace you, but we're not going to beg you. And that's what I love about Benito Floro. Daniel, thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedule. People can read it up at MLSsoccer.com. You did a wonderful piece there talking about Will Johnson, Atiba Hutchinson, on and on. So great of you to do that. And I thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the upcoming games that are coming up, my friend.
Thanks as always, Anthony. I don't know if enjoy is ever quite the word I'm watching Canada. I can never truly get the butterflies out, but I will make the most of it. That's all.
Are you making the trip up here to Toronto?
Unfortunately, can't make it out this time. But if we do end up making the Hex, I will certainly find some money in my travel budget.
You better make sure, if we get to the Hex, I'll put up a crowdfunding source to get you over here. That's for sure. Daniel, thank you so much again. Have a great night, my friend.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Anthony.
That is Daniel Squizzato, class act, and what a gentleman he is. And you can read his great piece at MLSsoccer.com.